though, is whether underpinning this naming system, we should also have a hierarchical 1.3.6. So you have a logical cataloging system for viruses, but at the end of that you have a name. And so the name is helpful, and the name is useful for the way that we can communicate with each other, but underpinning it, you maybe have this framework of numbers. And I don't know whether Nick wants to comment. There's a comment here.
Yes, but then you will need to make sure that the naming of each strain will not take 2 pages, and that's the way we are going at the moment. From a single name like Omanissa, we have now almost a line for each strain, and this is not practical.
But it is important that we make sure that we know what we are talking about, and in a sense, when we talk colloquially and in dialogue, we don't go through the whole nomenclature in the same way as you can describe a house in a street. You don't need to start off at the country level. So I think it's important that we do have this classification system, and maybe you're right, we need some form of shorthand way of describing it. But I think, for example, India 2001, we are familiar with what that means, and Pan-Asia, we're also familiar with what that means.
Yeah, I agree. We can end up with names that are huge, but we don't have to use the whole name, as you said. And in publications, for example, in many things, you state the full names of things in the first place, and then after that you use abbreviations or use parts of the names. But I think the use of things like West and East Africa 1 or WEA 1, that is short enough. I don't think that was a problem. And I think that having an underlying decimal kind of system might be useful, particularly for use in computers and databases. It might be useful, but I don't see that as really being an everyday usage. But it could underpin it, and I think that it's very difficult sometimes to name, for example, the West and East Africa one. We could have said and North Africa, but we know that it's not in Libya at the moment, and it may no longer be in Egypt in the future, and so maybe the core places where some of these viruses exist are where the names come from, we hope. Thanks.
Richard?
I was just thinking about the flu situation. I have to admit that I don't think that situation arose kind of deliberately. That we now have viruses, lineages that have names like H3N2, 3C2A, 197R, 142K, and it's like absolutely, fair enough. There are half a dozen people who understand what that means, but to be honest, it's something that just evolved from. Okay, we've got H3N2, and then they started giving numbers to them, and then they added letters, and then they added more numbers, and they added more letters, and then they started saying, oh, well, with this particular substitution as well. And actually, I don't think it's really helped at all. I like this scheme where there's a simple label that we can associate with it, and having a second label, I think, would just, my feeling is it would just make things more confusing, not less.
Yeah, and probably an open door, but I can imagine that nowadays there's all these jumps. We are not going to change the geographical name all the time. Eh? We stick to the original circulation, or not?
I don't know whether Antonello will appreciate me putting him on the spot, but the presentation that you gave yesterday, you talk about different viral lineages that have been described in the Middle East, and it's very clear that they're not all equal. So some of them are rather large lineages that are everywhere, and some are much more restricted lineages. And so those have arisen due to the fact that people have just decided that this new virus needs a new name. But there's been no really proper scientific basis to the naming of those lineages. And I suppose what we're trying to do now is just to add a little bit of order to the system. you want to say anything, Antonella, or you're happy with what I just said? Okay. I mean, I think this was the sort of the first part of the discussion, and I think it's useful for the community to hear a little bit about what we're doing in terms of nomenclature. And as I said, advise you to look at the website, and you can find more information there. And we will try to enhance this and develop this capacity a little bit more over the next coming years. For the remaining part of the discussion, I really wanted to get some feedback on Paolo's presentation, get some thoughts from those of you in the room that are interested in FMD sequences, and what are the current gaps in our capability, understanding what those gaps are, and understanding what the new tools might look like going forward. And really, this is an opportunity for those of you that may be slightly frustrated with the existing system to let us know what you need. We can explain a little bit about what we are trying to do and where we are now. I think Paolo has already given a nice presentation of the current status, and we can maybe enhance a little bit more about the types of tools and what we might imagine they would look like going forward. Does anybody want to kick off the discussion relating to FMD sequences? So Richard.
So one thing I've mentioned in the past when we've discussed the idea of having FMD sequences online was is the fact when it comes to vaccine matching, which Paolo seemed to be saying is the next step, is being able to see the relationship between sequences. Because in other contexts, often what you see when you look at, say, next flu and things like this, that you see that you basically you can superimpose information about one particular antiserum or whatever on the map, but you can't say, okay, well, what I want to do is to see what the relationship is between pairs of viruses. One of them is the vaccine strain, and one of them is the virus that was used in the experiment. So being able to see that relationship between pairs I think would be very useful.
So I think that's a really good question, and it's really good somebody from Mariel is in the room, so maybe they can comment on the restrictions relating to sequences of vaccine antigens.
Well, I was not willing to say something about that, but about something else.
But I think it is an important topic,
yeah,
so it'd be worthwhile.
Of course it's important, and this might be the second part of what I will say. When we are looking for new strains, for developing new strains, or for vaccine matching, it's important for us to have IDs other than R1. R1 is clearly not fully satisfactory at the moment, and if we can get access to the circulating sequences, we can have a better idea if the circulating viruses are evolving as compared to the vaccine strain, and that can be a tool to decide whether or not to develop a new strain. So availability of, maybe not of sequence, but of trees without the sequence, to see whether we are as compared to what is circulating, can be also an important tool for us to decide whether or not the vaccine is likely to protect, or if we have to develop something new. As to availability of sequences from vaccine strains, well, you have to understand that we are working in a competition environment, and we are not always willing that the competitors know exactly what strain is in our vaccine. Because if it's an advantage as compared to us, to them, we will provide them the information of this advantage. And I'm sorry to say that we are competitors. This is reality.
Emmy, you want to comment?
Yes, just a comment to emphasize that the new nomenclature is based on genetic data, in contrast to the origin of FMD, when the viruses were differentiated based on R values and antigenicity. So there is this should be clear, I think. And we had some evidence. Also, Valerie presented in his talk said that there is not, we have not to expect in a good correlation between genetic data and antigenicity or antigenic phenotype or profile. Sometimes it doesn't occur. Valerie showed that within the Okatai lineage, there are some viruses that were detected by the test she's using, and some other that were not detected. They are within the same lineages. So we should, I think, this may be a subject of discussion. We should think to keep this in mind. But I agree that we should have the sequence of virus strain, or vaccine strains. Independent of what I've said, it's another issue, I think.
My question is regarding the tool that is used for comparing the sequences and drawing the phylogeny or any other information regarding the sequence that is submitted. So what happens to the sequence that is submitted to the site? Does it go into your database or?
Paolo, would you like to answer that? Or maybe with the mic.
So we are not keeping any information which is submitted at the moment. So nothing. Just it's considered to produce the tree or whatever you're looking for, but it's not kept in any way.
I mean, of course, going forward, that would be a good way to do some enhanced surveillance for FMD. And I mean, that's at the moment what's being imagined is quite a simple series of tools that you won't even need a password to get into. So you'll just be freely accessible on the web. But you could imagine that if we started to collect information for who was accessing the data, we could see what sequences they were submitting, and then we could contact them and say, you know, do you want us to help you do anything with these sequences? But we're not, at the moment, that's not what's being imagined, but within the network, that could be.
That's what I recommend, because each and every reference lab has because each and every reference lab develops its own sequences, and at the end of the year, some of the sequences are sent to the reference lab, and then you do a phylogenetic tree. But most of the time, the outbreak has occurred and spread across continents, and then we find that this lineage has spread across in a period of time. But if you can do that in real time, that once a sequence is generated by a reference lab and it is uploaded, in real time, if a tree can be generated, we don't need to see the sequences, but at least the tree on how the viruses are moving. It would be good for the other non-endemic countries to see how the viruses are moving and know the information in real time, instead of finding it 1 year or 2 years later. That's the idea. Thank you.
I mean, that's in a part, that's what's motivating us to try to improve the display of the information. I don't know whether Nick will comment on this in a minute, but one of the slight tensions is that we have a certain responsibility to the customers that are sending us the material. So I think the idea that sequences get immediately put into the public domain is probably not very achievable in the short term, because people are sending samples to us. They want the report. They want a little bit of time to digest that report. And because we're talking largely here about transboundary diseases, it's useful that the country that submits the samples get the information first rather than neighboring countries. But that's something that we can hopefully address and think about going forward. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, I think although we won't be capturing the data that Paolo described, I think we would encourage people to submit sequences to us for inclusion in the database, and also encourage people to publish and submit the sequences to GenBank as well. But they can send us sequences for more detailed analysis, which we will keep confidential until published. So I think there's a number of things that can be done, not so much automatically, although we could amend the website to include, do you wish to submit this sequence to us officially or do you not want to, along with metadata as well. So I think that it can be fairly flexible at the moment. And as Don says, we can't necessarily release sequences all the time, but in recent years, when there have been important disease circumstances, we have released data, and these days often full genome data to the public databases very quickly. And I think we would see more of that happening. And maybe at some stage there will be a lot of our data submitted. I mean, for example, the study that Antonello is doing at the moment will probably end up with something like 1,000 VP1 sequences being submitted to GenBank. It would be nice before the end of the year, but I'm not sure exactly when we'll do it. But those are, data has occurred over a number of years, and I think that will increase the availability of data for people to analyse themselves. And we will try and do more and more of that. And I wish we could, publish more quickly so that we could release more data. It would be nice to do that. I think that's about it. Was there any other thing that you wanted me to comment on? No?
If I could press the button, it would be helpful. No, I think that's very helpful, Nick. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? Any ideas? So Jose, I think, at the back.
To what extent will the Nagoya protocol will have an impact on the release of these sequences?
I had a case in my ear. Sorry, I missed the question.
Okay, I will repeat my question. To what extent will the Nagoya protocol will have an impact on the release of the sequences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Short answer is I don't know. I mean, in a sense, we're not exploiting the sequences for any purposes when we're putting them into the public domain. I think for those of you who are not familiar with the Nagoya protocol, this is a new protocol, and I think most of the countries that are represented in the room have probably signed up to that protocol. And it defines basically the rules by which scientists and others can exploit biologically collected material. And I mean, something that we have talked quite a lot about in the reference laboratory, and I think in terms of all of us that are working to do diagnostic work outside of our own borders, it's something that we need to consider. I mean, I have not specifically thought about the impact of Nagoya on this sequence database, and I'm hoping that it is not a problem. But it's a good point, and maybe it's something that we do need to just check before we go live. Okay. Well, but of course, I mean, in the first iterations of the database, the sequences are not available anyway. So it's more a tool. An annotation tool is the first iteration of the device, so that shouldn't be a problem for that. Okay, any other thoughts, points, Case?
Another one away from sequencing, and that is directed to Valerie and Emmy, and that was about the potential risk that we always have that we are going to miss certain strains with this ever evolving virus. I'm fond of these kits. Emmy knows about it. I like them, but they are monoclonal based. I would have less concerns with, in that sense, I would have less concerns with the polyclonal based kits than with the monoclonals. And for type A, you already have to use 2 different monoclonals, and for some of the serotypes, you have been able to do a more extensive validation than for others. So I would like to hear your comments, if you also think that this is a concern or not.
It is also my concern, but this, I think, the presence of a so-called pan-EuFMD test within the kits can at least alert us that something is moving. If that is positive and no other, and it is not serotyped, it can alert us that something may be moving new, and we should look at it better. At the moment, we are realizing of monoclonal antibodies that were selected by testing really hundreds of strains, and at the moment they seem to be the best and seems to work better than even a polyclonal sera, something that I would never expect. But I sincerely, we have to maintain alert.
Valerie, do you want to make any comment?
That's also why we need to have real, proper redundancy in the tests, and we don't just rely on one of them to give us the answers. So we use our integrin ELISA. We could also use EMI's ELISA. We have sequencing, so it's not just one test giving us the answer. The other thing is actually, which has just gone completely out of my mind, so it's really looking good. Sorry.
Yes, but in your laboratory, in our national reference laboratories, the problem does not exist because we have plenty of tests. The problem may be in endemic countries that have only one test and they rely on it.
That is the point, of course, that when it is used as a frontline diagnostic and you would rely on the negative results to be truly negative, well, of course. But I think it's a good point that there is a pan-FMD monoclonal which seems to work always, so thank you.
Okay, we're coming to a close. Any further questions, any further points that want to be raised?
May I
So,
add
Emmy?
something different than we have discussed now, but it's late, and so I don't want to open a discussion now, but just to leave a message, and the discussion may be online because we have this opportunity. And my concern is about serology. FMD serology is quite complex. We have different tests and with different performances. We should be able to select the test that best fit for purposes, but sometimes we have in doubt. And so, for example, I'm wondering if we need some guidelines in countries like 3 European countries, which test should we use? We are using FMD serology for import-export, animal movements, not for suspect. So which test should we use? SP ELISAs, which serotypes? Or NSP ELISA, it's enough, even if less sensitive maybe than SP. So if we can have an online discussion on what the countries or the laboratories are behaving in this subject, I think could be useful.
Okay, Emmy, I think that's a good point that can be carried forward. Okay, any further points? See, people are itching to go to lunch. So we will try to put some thoughts together regarding, I mean, particularly I think for me, the nomenclature working group I think is very clear. I don't think maybe there's so much discussion to be had there. It's very clear what it does, and it's there really for the community. I think in terms of the sequence databases and the annotated data sets that can be used for phylogenetics, I think that's something that we will try to put together in terms of a position paper that can be shared with you so you can see where we are going and people can comment and provide feedback. I don't have anything more that I want to say. I look at my co-chairs. So I thank my co-chairs, Case and Emmy, for their interaction. I thank you all for your participation in this session, and you are now excused to go to lunch.